In this video I will be doing a short review of every mainline Final Fantasy game. I will have to mention a few things first to make sure we avoid any misunderstandings. So first of all, almost each of these games has many versions, but I will only be reviewing the latest versions. No spin-offs, no sequels. Also, I will skip the 2 MMO games because I'm not into MMOs. They require too much time and money and they don't offer nearly as much entertainment as good single player games. Also, my channel is mainly focused on gameplay, that's what matters most, at least to me, and that's what I will be focusing on. I will mention the story of each game a little bit. As far as the music of this entire franchise goes, it's pretty much perfect. Every single one of these games has almost perfect music. I'm saying that so I won't have to mention the music of each game individually. If you are looking for high quality classical music, look no further than this franchise. It's filled with amazing soundtracks. Another thing I want to mention, this franchise is older than most of you people watching. The first game was released before even I was born, and the reason this franchise is loved so much is because almost every single one of these games was considered a masterpiece of its time. That being said, I will be judging the games based on how well they hold up for today's standards. So I won't be pulling any punches, no sugarcoating, and let's get to it. Final Fantasy I, the game that started it all. The story in this game is almost non-existent. It's barely there just to give context on why you are doing whatever you are doing. Like the first thing you do is talk to a king and he tells you to rescue a princess. Similar to the old Mario games, a princess is supposed to exist at the end of a castle just to give you context on why you are doing all that platforming and killing all those Goombas. Now as far as the gameplay goes, it's very simple and repetitive. It doesn't require any decision making besides picking the right target for your attack. There are only 6 classes and you choose 4 as your starting team, and most of them play by simply attacking enemies without having any skills and without much customization. The ones who do have a few skills are the mage classes, but even those are limited. You run out of mana really fast and then they end up playing like the fighter classes by simply attacking. Almost halfway through the game, by doing a quest, all of your classes get upgraded, and even the fighter classes, which were playing mostly by doing basic attacks, become capable of using a bit of magic, and the mage classes just get more spells. It's pretty simple, nothing extraordinary. Is it good? No. The combat is a 3 out of 10, it gets boring pretty fast, the enemy variety is nothing special either. The only reason to play this game is to see how it all started. Final Fantasy II is one of the most hated games of the franchise. This was the first attempt to make an actual story. The characters actually have names, they interact with each other every now and then, and the entire world feels more alive. Every town you visit, and even the main villains, they feel like they have a little bit of a soul. Now the reason this game is hated is because of its combat. In the first game you just level up normally. Once you reach a new level, your stats are increased. It works pretty normally, like most RPGs. In Final Fantasy II, they decided to make a huge change to the combat. So here's how it works. The more you attack with a weapon type, the stronger you become using that weapon type. The more you take damage, the more your health increases. And the more you use a spell, the stronger that spell becomes, and so on. It's honestly not a bad idea, it's just the execution wasn't well implemented. But overall, I can easily say this game is better than Final Fantasy I in both story and combat, putting it on a 4 out of 10. Still nothing I can recommend you, it's not worth playing or anything, unless you really want to check out its unique combat and maybe you can get some inspiration out of it. If done well, it could have been amazing. The Elder Scrolls games have a similar combat system to that, but then again the Elder Scrolls games don't have an amazing combat either. Final Fantasy III is pretty much a direct improvement of Final Fantasy I. There is more story, almost as much as Final Fantasy II, and there are more jobs or classes, so you can switch your characters to whichever class or job you need at any time. For example, you can make everyone a black mage, start bombarding your enemies with spells until you are out of mana, and then change your team to fighter classes like monks or warriors. It allows more flexibility, but still there are times when it feels like the game really wants you to play certain classes/jobs. It feels kind of forced and it ruins the gameplay experience a little bit, so it's inferior in both story and gameplay to Final Fantasy II, putting it at 3.5 out of 10, but later on, if you manage to move past the early parts of the game that feel forced, once you get the better classes/jobs, it manages to surpass Final Fantasy II in terms of gameplay, but then again, it's not worth your patience. It's not that good of a game, it's another one you can easily skip. Final Fantasy IV is their first game that has an actual story, and it's decently interesting. There are lots of stuff happening that revolve around the main character, the side characters, the world. It keeps you constantly interested while you are going through it. The gameplay is still not that good. It starts off as kind of lacking, where the main character has barely any skills, but the few side characters you meet throughout the story do have a decent amount of spells. It's mostly black and white magic, where black magic is used for offensive purposes and white magic is used for defensive purposes. Now the sad part is that all black mages are very similar to each other and all white mages are also similar to each other. Later on the main character becomes a paladin and he is capable of using some white magic, but it's still the same stuff as everyone else had. There isn't that much distinction between characters gameplay wise, and there is also a lot of randomness. Sometimes skills just don't work and other times you destroy your enemies and trivialize bosses. So the combat starts off as a 4 out of 10 game and it ends as barely a 6 out of 10 game. Once again, it's not something I can recommend you to get into. It's not worth your patience. It never really gets that good anyway, and the story isn't good enough to carry the gameplay. Another game you can easily skip. Final Fantasy V. Similar to Final Fantasy IV, it has an actual story. The story isn't really that good, but the characters are more enjoyable. There are lots of funny moments with their interactions. They are way more likable. As for the gameplay, Final Fantasy V returns to the job/class system, where you can once again choose each of your characters and assign them to any job you want. This time you have a huge variety of jobs. There is a lot of customization and the game even allows you to choose a secondary job. While the primary job you put will be the one that's leveling up and learning new abilities or spells, the secondary job functions in kind of a weird way. Let me explain. So, in a game called Bravely Default 2, which is another Square Enix turn-based RPG, it has a very similar job system where you select your primary job for a character, you select the secondary job, you get all the active abilities you have learned for both the jobs, but you can choose passive skills from any job, which allows you a lot of customization. Now in Final Fantasy V, if your secondary job is a mage class like Black Mage, White Mage, Red Mage or Blue Mage, once you put them as your secondary job, you get to use all of that class spells. But if you try using a fighter job as your secondary one, you only get to choose one of their passive or active abilities. Which means if you want to be a white mage as a primary job and the monk as a secondary job, you will only get to choose to either get the monk's empty-handed passive skill or the extra health they get or the counter attack. You only get to pick one. But if you choose your monk as your primary class and your white mage as your secondary class, then you get all the monks and the white mage's abilities, which is a really weird way to make a game. It's very limited and lacking and seems like the mages have an unfair advantage, and they are even genuinely more fun to play since they have such a huge variety of spells instead of relying on spamming the same skill over and over again. That being said, the game is not bad at all, it's actually quite mediocre and it even gets better, starting from a 5 out of 10 game, reaching to a 6 out of 10 later on. Moving on to Final Fantasy VI. Now this game has the best story of the entire franchise, and all the characters are super likable, well fleshed out, to the point that if this had a really good combat, it could have been a masterpiece. And to be honest, this is the game that deserves a remake the most of them all. The only reason they made a remake of 7 is because Final Fantasy VII is the most popular one, and their goal was to make more money based on its popularity. It was a marketing decision and nothing more. I'm not saying Final Fantasy VII Remake is bad, I'm just saying Final Fantasy VII is the one that needed a remake the least out of all the old ones. Anyway, let's get to the Final Fantasy VI gameplay. So, the gameplay is actually bad. Pretty much Final Fantasy I levels of bad. All the characters have unique abilities of their own, but their abilities are broken. They can do insane amounts of damage for no cost at all. You can spam the most broken abilities constantly with no downside, making the battles brain dead. The game pretty much plays on its own. There really isn't much thought process put into it. Later on, all the characters learn to use spells, and the later spells you get in the game are pretty broken, so pretty much every single one of them becomes a super strong magician, and you just start spamming spells for the entirety of the game. So yeah, sadly the combat is terrible, and even though the story is good enough to carry the combat, it's still not something I could recommend to anyone unless you have really low gameplay standards. All we need to do is wait until a remake comes out, and if Square knows what's best for them, they will make a remake of this. Final Fantasy VII. This one is the most popular of the entire franchise. For some people, this is one of the most important games of their childhood and one of the most impactful games they have ever played. That includes me, by the way. This and Metal Gear Solid 1 are my favorite PS1 games. Of course, that doesn't mean I'm going to make an emotional review of this. I'll tell you right now, the game is actually very overrated. It's still a good game, but very overrated. So let's start with the story. The story of this game is actually really good. It has some horror themes, some mystery themes. The main antagonist is really great because he is pretty much perfect. He has everything: looks, strength, brains, and he is not even the only one you should be concerned with. The company that you are trying to take down has lots of smart characters and organizations that cause you trouble throughout the entirety of the game, all of them being interesting. The reason the story is so good is because it has so many plot twists, it has so much depth, and it actually requires a decent amount of intelligence to understand. There is a downside to the story though. It's incomplete. Some of the main characters aren't well fleshed out, there are many things still not explained, and the ending is pretty much a cliffhanger. There are also some dialogues that are poorly translated. Like, the game has actually a lot of flaws that prevent it from being as good as the fandom tries to make it be. Now let's get to the combat. The combat is actually really good. It has managed to age pretty well. It uses a materia system where all spells and skills and passive abilities are some kind of small orbs called materia, and you can equip any character with any materia you want, along with every character having unique weapons, armor and accessories. Also, there is support materia which are linked to certain kinds of materia. For example, the all materia, when linked to any kind of magic materia, it targets all members, whether allies or enemies, allowing you to customize your party to a heavy extent. I have played this game 6 times and I always find new stuff to play around, and it's always enjoyable. Now, of course, it's far from perfect. Besides the few bugs it has, the game is fundamentally easy. It only starts getting challenging towards the end of it. And of course it has some extra endgame dungeons which are also pretty good. I'm giving the combat a 7.5 out of 10. It's definitely worth it, but there is one thing I have noticed the Final Fantasy VII fandom doing. They try to manipulate people into playing this game by straight up lying and saying how it's the best thing ever or it's flawless, whether in terms of combat or story. Now let me tell you this. The game is good, but it's okay to skip it. If you don't like the graphics, even though it's a shallow reason, it's still fine to skip it. There are also some graphic mods to help make the experience better, but still it's totally fine to skip this game. Instead, you can check out the remake, which does almost everything better except for the story pacing. Most of the OG fans will tell you that the remake is bad because the story is changed. So the story of the remake is only changed during the end of it, and the changes happen in a sense that the game is trying to tell you you don't know what to expect from the next parts, and that's not a bad thing. The original fans are blinded with nostalgia and don't want to accept any change. For them, change equals bad, when in reality, since we haven't seen the changes, we can't really come to the conclusion whether they made the story worse or better. We will need to see the rest of it to judge appropriately. Change doesn't equal bad. it equals potentially better or potentially worse, and that remains to be seen. So if you want to play only the remake, then go ahead and don't let anyone tell you otherwise. If anything, the remake will have the complete story, fully fleshed out, properly explained, and with a proper ending. Final Fantasy VIII is another one of the most hated in the franchise. This game tried to copy everything that makes 7 great and tried to make it even greater, but sadly it failed miserably. The story is an absolute mess that makes little to no sense. It still has a few really nice moments, but the overall story is poorly told. The characters are fewer and they are not that good either. They are not bad or anything, but they are not nearly as quirky and interesting as in Final Fantasy VII. You can see the main character has many similarities with the main character of 7, like the hair and the personality. The villain is decently interesting and mysterious, but she's not nearly as smart as Sephiroth. Now let's get to the combat. The combat is an absolute mess, just like the story. In all previous games, you get strong by mostly leveling up your characters. In this game, the enemies become strong along with you, which means by simply leveling up, you are making the game way harder on yourself instead of making it easier. So how do you become stronger, you might ask? Well, the game requires you to equip some deities that exist in the entire franchise, but here they are called Guardian Forces. By equipping a Guardian Force, you get to set up a command menu, which depends on what abilities the Guardian Force have, and it will allow you to use commands besides basic attacks such as Magic, Guardian Force, Item, Draw, and others. So Magic is for casting spells, Item is for using items. GF is to summon the Guardian Forces. But what does the Draw do? So in this game, you don't learn spells or abilities, you don't use them by equipping certain weapons or items or accessories or anything like that. Instead, you draw the spells from the enemies, similar to stealing items. You use the draw command and you have a chance of drawing anywhere from 0 to 9 of the spells you chose to draw. The amount drawn depends on how strong the magic of that character is. Then once you draw that magic, you can use it the amount of times it was drawn. Or you can use it to strengthen your stats, like health, strength, magic, etc. If that sounds confusing to you, it's because it is. That's one of the main reasons the game is hated. It takes a lot of time to figure out the combat for a first timer, and once you figure it out, you realize that it allows you a lot of customization, but it's not balanced. It can break very easily. There are ways to become extremely strong very early in the game, trivializing every single one of your encounters. Of course, that probably won't happen on your first playthrough, so your first playthrough is going to be decently challenging because you are still figuring out the combat and you cannot properly optimize it. On your second playthrough, since you will have learned all the tricks, you will realize there is pretty much no challenge to the game at all. And on your third playthrough, you will once again realize that the game's combat is so flexible, it allows you to create your own challenge, create your own hard mode by using self-limitations. So yeah, this game's combat is pretty much an average 5 of 10, but by playing around it and limiting yourself on all the broken stuff, you can probably increase it to a 7 out of 10. Other than that, it pretty much does everything worse than Final Fantasy VII, except for one thing. And no, I'm not talking about the graphics. In fact, there is one thing this game does better than any other game of this franchise: the open world exploration. This game has some of the most fun open world to explore. There are so many dungeons and open areas with so many unique enemies, making all of the battle encounters interesting. Also, remember when I told you the enemies get stronger and level up along with you, which means every time you come back to the same places, you will find these enemies having way more insane attacks, being way more challenging and allowing you to draw even better magic from them. The game has a way of making you want to explore, if you are into that stuff, of course. There is just so much stuff going on in the open world, so much mystery. Many of the times, the results of your explorations won't be worth it, but for me personally, since I like exploring a lot, the adventure itself is the reward. So if you want a game with a really good open world, then I can actually recommend you this one. Other than that, there isn't much of a reason to play this. Final Fantasy IX. This one has the second best story of the franchise. Now, the character design is what drove most people away, the chibi models, they all look tiny, but if you can look past that, the story is totally worth it, the characters are really likable. The combat is pretty much a direct evolution of Final Fantasy IV. Each character has their role in battle, like warrior, thief, black mage, white mage, and you learn abilities from the equipment. Each piece of equipment has an ability or spell to offer, and by using it in battles, you slowly gain experience until you finally learn those abilities. It's pretty simple really, it doesn't offer that much customization, it's not bad but it's not that good either. Pretty decent I would say. 6 out of 10 for this one. It has a few frustrating or weird moments, but it's nothing special. The story is definitely good enough to carry the combat as long as you can look past the character models. There are also rumors of a Final Fantasy IX remake coming out, so maybe you want to wait on that one. Final Fantasy X is considered a timeless masterpiece, and for a good reason I might say, but it's also kind of hated by some. The story is really good, pretty straightforward, it has a lot of great moments, some emotional ones, some funny ones. Some people like to pretend the main character is bad because he is a goofball instead of a cool edgelord. I personally think it's fine. I like the way the story is told through a relatable goofy main character, but I would also argue that there is more than one main character. In fact, the rest of the characters are so good, almost any of them could be the main one. Plus, you can take out Tidus from your party and replace him with anyone else at pretty much any time. Another thing I hear from people who dislike the story is they hate the actor of the main character because of a certain laughing scene. In reality, the people who hate that scene are actually stupid and didn't understand what the scene is all about. There is an entire video explaining it properly. By the way, I played this game when I was 12 years old, English is not my first language and I still managed to perfectly understand it the first time, so they have no excuse. Another reason this game is hated is because it's extremely linear. There is no open world exploration, there is just a straight line you follow for most of the part with a few side roads for chests. Now, as someone who grew up with the older titles, I understand why they see that as a problem, but linear doesn't equal bad. A game can be linear and great, and this is a perfect example of it. The open world exploration in the older games was giving you a freedom, finding new stuff like equipment, items, and giving you a chance to encounter new weird, strong enemies, making the combat more interesting every now and then. In Final Fantasy X, the combat is so good, it's always interesting. You have a team of 7 characters, every single one of them is unique in almost every way, having skills, specials, magic and super attacks, which are called overdrive, and you can also swap characters during combat, making this the best turn-based game of the franchise. The mana costs, the enemy difficulty, pretty much everything is really well balanced to be at the right amount of challenge to keep you constantly interested. The game is a great 9.5 out of 10 from start to finish, and there is also an extra dungeon for those who didn't get enough of the combat. Now here's where the game actually gets bad. There are some endgame bosses which require tons of grinding and they are not even interesting at all. They expect you to acquire some game-breaking equipment that makes your party almost unkillable and also allows you to constantly use your super attacks, making the combat monotonous and relying on raw power instead of strategy. Of course you can skip all that, it's just unnecessary side stuff which they put there just as extra content. Final Fantasy XII is a very mediocre game. The story is mediocre, it has some interesting parts, some boring parts. There are only 6 characters, 3 of them feel like they are completely out of place, like they are not really offering anything to the story. And the combat is also pretty boring. So here's how it works. First of all, it's all done in real time. You can pause at any time to choose and give a command to a character. But since the enemies are really tanky, really spongy, if you had to do that all the time, the game would feel like an eternity and would probably put you to sleep due to repetition. Instead, there is a gambit system that allows you to automate pretty much all actions, like attacking certain enemies at certain health or casting spells or using skills, healing, buffing, you pretty much automate the entire combat through the Gambit system. The only things you still need to activate manually are super attacks or summons, and sadly those aren't even that good, so you don't get to use them that much. So the game is like 95% preparation and like 5% engaging in the action. Of course that doesn't necessarily mean it's bad, but in all honesty there aren't that many options and you end up just watching your characters do their stuff for almost the entirety of the game. You make a few adaptations every now and then when you get new equipment or when you learn new skills and spells, but once you set them up you just keep watching your team do all the fighting automatically for the next couple of hours until you get new stuff again and make a few new changes again. It sounds boring because it is. If there is one thing this game does well, it has some huge open areas that are fun to explore, meeting new enemies or entering secret areas or high level areas that you are not supposed to be. And also there are a lot of strong creatures to hunt and lots of rare monsters to kill. Other than that there isn't really much of a reason to play this game, it's just a mediocre experience in general. Now, my biggest problem with this game is some of the end game stuff, which don't really matter since you don't ever have to do that. I just want to mention it though, because it's not just bad, it's some of the worst stuff I've seen in a video game. This game has arguably the worst boss fight in all of video game history and also one of the worst dungeons I've seen in an RPG. So let me tell you about the dungeon first. The dungeon looks like that, and you change areas through moving on these platforms that become only visible once you step on them. And once you change an area, the next area looks very similar, almost identical to the previous one. And every single area of the dungeon looks like that. That's straight up eye cancer. And there is also no map, which means if you don't constantly keep in mind where you are, you will definitely get lost and it's an absolute nightmare to find your way back. But the biggest problem of this dungeon is the enemies. The enemies are straight up cancer. Like the combat wasn't boring enough, there are enemies that once are killed, they respawn, and those enemies that respawned can also multiply, making the fights last way too long for no good reason at all, while you're just sitting there and looking at your screen, watching your characters fight all these enemies, wasting so much of your time, while not even having any pretty areas around to look at. Now let's talk about the worst boss fight. So in this game, there are some limitations. In the first version of this game, the damage was limited to 9999, which is stupid because there are enemies with tons of health and there was just no reason at all to limit the players to this amount. How much amount of health do you think that boss has? It has 50 million health. Do you know how much time it takes to kill it? 3.5 hours of you just staring on your screen. And if you think that's bad, the boss has also a skill that it uses once it's in the final 1 or 2 millions and it fully heals it, making you pretty much restart the whole fight, taking you a total amount of 7 hours. For whatever reason, some people are still pretending to this day that this boss fight is good somehow and that beating it is some kind of an accomplishment. So you can already tell what kind of sick people are part of the fandom. Final Fantasy XIII. So after making Final Fantasy X linear, which people didn't like, and Final Fantasy XII being the opposite of 10, which is bad in every way except for the open areas, you would expect the Final Fantasy XIII to learn from the previous titles and be a combination of the two best things, like take the great story, characters and gameplay from Final Fantasy X and take the open area design from Final Fantasy XII and finally make a great game that combines the best of both those games. Well, no, Final Fantasy XIII manages to make everything worse. Not only is the story and characters way worse than it was in 12, it's also way more linear than 10. Yes, somehow that's possible. This game is so bad, it's absolute dogshit. It's pure trash. I don't even know where to begin to describe how bad this game is. I'll tell you something. There is a trailer of this game, the official trailer from Square Enix. You should go and watch that, and by doing so, you have pretty much absorbed every little bit of good this game has to offer, which is the music, the graphics, a little bit of the fighting scenes, and that's it. That's all. The rest of the game is absolute dogshit. The story is such unbelievable nonsense. It's by far the worst story of the franchise. Completely nonsensical, it's not even trying to make sense. This is like something Tommy Wiseau would write. It's so much bullshit, it's unbelievable. And the characters are so bad, they all feel soulless. And all the areas are pretty much linear and pointless even, they are fillers, just making the game longer for no reason. Like, there is one character that's so bad, this guy Snow. He is the dumbest character in the entire franchise by far. And being stupid is one thing, but the guy is absolutely useless as well.
I'll protect Sarah. And Cocoon.
Does she look protected to you?
I can save her!
What can you possibly do?
You're the worst of them all. I hate your kind. You think you're everyone's protector, everyone's hero, but who do you save, really? Do you even realize how useless you are? Do you realize what you do to the people you're supposed to protect?
And the funniest thing is that he's the one who has kind of a romantic relationship throughout Final Fantasy XIII, out of all of them. Which is really hilarious to me, because in what world would anyone want to date such an absolute retard? Why would anyone want to breed with such a stupid person? You realize your children are all going to have Down syndrome if you breed with this absolute dipshit. And now let's get to the combat. So how bad is it? In Final Fantasy XII, you just automate the entire battle by preparing it with a gambit system. Well, in Final Fantasy XIII, you cannot automate the battle, but it still plays on auto mode. It just expects you to constantly press the X button for your characters to continue doing the attacks that they decided are better for the situation. You don't even get to properly customize them so you can have control of the battle. So the game just plays itself for pretty much its entirety, and you just keep pressing the X button so they can keep doing the same moves over and over again. There is one thing you can do. Each character has kind of a class similar to the jobs of the previous games, and there is a button to change their classes, and they all play certain roles during combat. So you would expect that to be at least something, right? Well, you are wrong. You don't change the role of every character individually. You can only change all three of them at once, which means you need to prepare these changes in sets of 3, and you don't have enough room to put as many changes as you want, and when you are trying to change, the game doesn't even pause. So your options are extremely limited, but it doesn't even matter because the game is so unbelievably easy and so unbelievably brain dead that changing the classes could have easily be automated. It doesn't require any intelligence whatsoever to make these changes. The game still plays itself, and actually it's even worse than the game playing itself because it makes you constantly press pointless buttons with no decision making whatsoever, just so the characters can keep doing the obvious stuff they should be automatically doing. So the game doesn't even remotely play as an RPG. You can barely call it a video game actually. And as far as the customization goes with leveling and gear, it's all horseshit. Absolutely terrible. There are no choices at all when it comes to leveling up your characters. When it comes to equipment, you have no way of knowing which weapons are better. You have no way of knowing how to level up your weapons properly. It's all just trial and error until you get it right. And for some reason, you can make a character your party leader, and he becomes the character you control outside of the battle as well. But if your party leader dies inside the battle, the game is just over. For some reason the game doesn't allow you to use revival items. There is just so much stuff that's wrong with this game, it's unbelievable. How do you screw up the combat that bad? Some of the story fights are so stupid, they just want you to stand there doing nothing. Literally just mashing a button until the end of the combat. And if you dare to try doing anything else except that, like if you try to experiment with how you can deal more effectively in that battle, the game actually punishes you for even trying to think outside of the box. The game straight up expects you to just do whatever it wants you to do. Just turn your brain completely off, shut it down, and mindlessly keep pressing the one button. I honestly don't think I need to say much more. It's easily worse than the first Final Fantasy, combat wise at least. 2 out of 10 combat. And by the way, the only reason I'm not giving this a 1 out of 10 is because games like Final Fantasy All the Bravest exist. Now, if you don't know what Final Fantasy All the Bravest is, you are happier not knowing, trust me. You will lose a lot of hope in humanity if you become aware of it. Final Fantasy 15. Now, this game is pretty much just as bad as Final Fantasy 13. The story is slightly better, at least in the latest version, because the first version was absolute dogshit, and I could easily tear this game to shreds like I did with 13, but I won't because I respect my sanity, I respect my time, and I respect your time as well. So yeah, don't even bother with this one. 2 out of 10, another game for the trash can. Final Fantasy 16, the last entry of the franchise. Now, this game is actually really good, but the reason I like it is because I like Devil May Cry games a lot. As an RPG, this is pretty much a failure. It barely has any RPG elements, and honestly, even if you remove the RPG elements and the entire leveling system, it wouldn't really affect much. It would just be another actual Devil May Cry game. The story is all over the place, it has some really cool moments, it has some boring moments, the pacing is kind of slow, the side quests are also all over the place, but hey, the combat is really good, that's what matters. If you want extra analysis of its combat, I have a 4-minute video in my channel explaining some of its flaws, feel free to check it out.